Good morning, everyone. And before we start today's session, uh, I want to convey apologies sent by Dr. Atul Modi for not foreseeing what Nishita ma'am was planning yesterday, and when he made a comment about interference and beats. But ma'am has later sent, and all of you must have received that updated thing about how gravitational beeps are observed. Okay, so apologies from Dr. Atul.
No apologies necessary, really, honestly. I mean, it was my pleasure that he pointed it out and that we fixed it online. In fact, that is the best way to learn, I feel. So there is absolutely no need for apologies at all.
So, ma'am, we can begin today's session.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, yeah, let me start by sharing. Okay, and yeah, since we just talked about yesterday's notebook, I just want to show you a few things that I simulated later on, so that we can talk about what exactly this gravitational wave interferometer does. Okay, so let me remind you first what we were talking about. So we had designed this interferometer that has two perpendicular legs, right? And you have a beam splitter in the middle. So you have a laser coming from a source and it splits the beam into two. And then the beam gets reconstructed back and then it goes into a detector. Okay. This was originally designed in the early 1900s to determine whether there is a medium through which light travels. And at that time, we expected beats because if there was a medium through which light travels, then you would expect a Doppler shift as we move through the medium. Okay. However, no such beats were observed, and of course we then came over to the more modern picture where the speed of light is a fundamental quantity. Speed of light in vacuum is a fundamental quantity, and so on. Right. However, this same setup is now used for detecting gravitational waves, where what happens is not that uh, there is this speed in a medium that makes the effect, but in fact, the effect happens because of the gravitational wave compressing space. So what happens is, imagine the gravitational wave is incident perpendicular to the surface of the Earth. It causes wobbles. So if you start with a circle, you have wobbles that first go like this, then maybe go like this, and then keep switching. Right? So you can imagine. Uh, uh, so if this was your interferometer, so this is equal L. So in this case, you will have a longer L here and a shorter L here, something like this. And in the other case, you will have a shorter L here and a longer L here. Okay, so you have this kind of wobble, and there is an easy way of describing this. So you start with some L to begin with, and this is L plus some amplitude times, say, sine theta, or sine some omega gravity times t, and this guy is L plus some amplitude of cos omega grav times t, right? So this is how you would model such a thing. So let's try and do that and see what we get. Okay. So let's come back to our notebook. Okay. So let me just remind you that we had these two phases. So for the first arm, we had the first reflection and the second reflection. And similarly for the second arm, we had first transmission and then the second reflection, right? Why have I copied this twice? Right. You can forget this. And then we did these with two different lengths, and then we compared. First of all, that you get an interference pattern of different amplitude. So this was what we did yesterday. So what I want to do today is essentially say you have a gravitational wave passing, which passes only for a short time. So your time goes from 0 to 100, but the gravitational wave only passes between time 30 and 70. And this is how I model the x and y arm using sine and cos functions. Okay, so right, so okay, so initially I had put 30 and 70. So then to make the figure better, so now it is, so now your time is between 0 and 1000, and the gravitational wave passes between 250 and 300. Okay, so it's exactly the same method. So first let us just model what the gravitational wave would look like. Okay, so if you are in the time where the gravitational wave passes, I say that it has, say, a constant amplitude, which I call 0.3. So since sine or cos go from plus or minus 1, I'm just using an amplitude of 0.3, which is smaller than 1. Okay, otherwise the amplitude is 0. Okay, so I just want to plot what this looks like. So this is what essentially I'm trying to simulate. So there's a blip of a gravitational wave that only comes for a short time, and you have your normal light wave that is oscillatory as usual. Okay, so these are for illustration, these frequencies, but we are going to go to a bit more higher frequencies to see the effect. So for example, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that light has a high frequency, say 500. We can actually ignore this. This L1 and L2 are not important. And the gravitational wave has a very small, slow, very small frequency. Okay, so it's a slow moving wave. And then we do the similar thing where you have between time of say 300 and 350, you have a gravitational wave with a small amplitude, and otherwise the amplitude is 0. Okay. This was your original wave of light. And then we do the thing with the sine and cos that I told you about. So in one case, you have the sine. So the one arm gives you a sine effect, right? Like this. And the other one gives you a cos effect. Like this. Okay. And I also have written down the expressions where you have no gravitational waves, so no L oscillations. Okay, so they look so just for comparison. So we are going to plot both of these cases again, so when you just you sum up the effects from both cases, so no L and L, or with gravitational wave, and you can plot them. So this is essentially what you see. So with so if you have no gravitational wave, as expected, there is no interference at all. Okay. But if you do have a gravitational wave, then in the time where the gravitational wave disrupted your phase, you will have this kind of a blip effect, where there is some beat efficiency going on inside. Okay. So this is what you expect. You can. So I also wanted to make this signal look more realistic. And to do that, I modeled the signal not just by a single gravitational wave with constant amplitude, but by what is called a chirp. So these gravitational waves are generated when you have two very massive bodies that are oscillating around each other and losing energy. Okay. As they lose energy, they come closer and closer to each other, which means they spiral faster and faster, right? So their frequency also changes. However, in this case, we are not going to change the frequency, but as they come closer, they will also lose more and more energy. So essentially, if you look at the amplitude when they are far is small, and as they come closer, the amplitude becomes larger and larger. Okay, so that is what we are going to try and model. And the way I modeled it is an exponential function. So I just, so with time, you want the amplitude to grow. So it's an exponent of time. And then I chose some parameters to normalize it so that it's not too large. So I don't want it to be much bigger than the amplitude of the light wave that we have. So I want a small amplitude, which is why there are these normalization factors. Okay, so this is not anything physics like. It's just an example of what a signal would look like. So let me plot that also. So instead of just a constant sine wave, now you can see what a realistic wave would look like. So you start with a small amplitude, and then the amplitude grows bigger, and then the two bodies that were oscillating around each other sort of collide and form one, and then you no longer have any more gravitational waves after that. Okay, so you want to see what effect of this signal has when you interfere two normal light waves. Okay, so then again we do exactly the same thing, except now the signal, the amplitude is given by this A-grav array that we designed. Okay, and you can perform the same calculation, and you see that without gravitational wave you again get a flat line as expected, but with the gravitational wave now you have a certain pattern. Okay, so you can look at yeah, you can look at the frequency of this pattern, and you can figure out what was the frequency of the oscillating objects, and use that to sort of determine the masses of the individual objects, how they are based on how fast they were rotating and so on. So the amplitude will give you some total mass, and then the frequency can tell you how to differentiate it. Okay, so that is what these experiments do when they detect gravitational waves. So this is a very simple toy model, and of course they do much more complex things. But this is one way of understanding what exactly is happening when people want to detect gravitational waves. Okay. Right. So yeah. So we can also compare side by side the form of the gravitational wave and the form that you see in the interferometer. Okay. All right. So this is all I wanted to say about gravitational waves. And I also want to show you another example with Fourier analysis, which was suggested to me yesterday. But before we go there, are there any further questions about this? Okay. Okay, so let's do another example with Fourier analysis. So remember what Fourier analysis does. It is sort of if you have a signal with multiple frequencies, what Fourier analysis does is it decomposes the frequency components, right? So this is example that we did yesterday. We started with 3 frequencies. So I just chose 3 random numbers so that we can reproduce rather than running the random number generator again. And what we did was we generated a signal which was a sum of these 3 frequencies, N1, N2, and N3. So these were set by hand, 10, 80, and 100. And then these amplitudes were given using these random numbers, right? And then if you remember, we plotted what the signal looks like, which looked like some wave. And then we also took the Fourier transform, which decomposed the 3 frequency components, right? And we found out that the amplitude that you see in this frequency plot is essentially half of the amplitude that we set here. Okay. So for example, this was something 0.2 something for 80, and the amplitude that we've chosen is 0.42. So 0.4. So that was what we found yesterday. And what I want to show you is what people do when they want to do signal analysis, where you know that there is known contamination from some frequencies that are coming from known sources. Say, for example, if you want to do some what is it called? Some radio wave astronomy, and you know that there are certain radio wave frequencies that are being used for local broadcast, then you can isolate those frequencies and remove those components by using this kind of Fourier analysis. Okay, so we are going to do that on this example that we have. So remember, we have 3 frequency components that we saw. First of all, I want to show you that you can actually reconstruct a very close copy of the signal by using these components and generating the signal back. So if I just give you this Fourier transform, so then for each frequency that we have, I know that the amplitude is twice the amplitude that you get from the Fourier transform. So this was the array that we made yesterday, that absolute value of the Fourier transform. So for each frequency, this is the amplitude, and then you could calculate the signal by summing up the amplitude times sine of that frequency, right? So frequency times 2 pi is omega times t. So that gives you a signal component. So you sum over all possible frequencies and you should get back your signal. Okay, so what I want to plot is the original signal and the signal will be reconstructed using the Fourier transform. So this is what it looks like. So this is the original signal and this is the signal we reconstructed from the Fourier transform. So you will notice that they are very similar, except that there are some problems towards the edges, and this mainly happens because our sample size is small. So if you have a very large sample size, a very large time sample, then this errors will be reduced. Okay, so this is the first check. So the first check is that the Fourier transform, you can indeed reconstruct the signal based on the Fourier transform. Now what I want to do
Just one
is that,
minute.
yeah.
Just 1 minute. Why is this amplitude half?
Oh, that's just the normalization that is used by this algorithm. So every algorithm has an internal normalization.
Hmm.
So some use a normalization of pi, some use 2 pi, yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Right. So we now have the reconstructed signal, and what I want to do now. So suppose we have an original signal of 10 hertz, and we know that there is some high frequency noise in this 10 hertz signal. Okay. So you want to remove the high frequencies, and we know looking at this that there are 2 main high frequency contributions at 80 and 100, right? So what we can do is, if the frequency is either 80 or 100, we don't sum up that component. So we just continue the loop, okay? And then we can plot what we get from the resultant. So what this is doing is it is summing up all Fourier components except these 2 that we know, okay? So you can see that this is then the result from the, let's call this subtracted. So you can see that this is now the result. So you had this very noisy signal, and then you subtracted the main noisy frequencies, and you could obtain back your signal. So you can again go back to the Fourier transform, and you see that these lines, which should in fact be just a single value bar graphs, do have some spread, right? So this is again because of our limited sample size. But what you can do is, instead of just removing just one, maybe what we can do is we can say you remove things that are say 2 points here or there. Okay, so so this will remove anything that is 80 or from 78 to 82. Okay, so similarly we can do the other guy as well. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, so yeah, you can play around with this to try and get a clearer. this is apparently the clearest. Yeah, but you can play around with this and remove the frequencies that you think are causing trouble and get back a cleaner sample. So for example, this sample now has a dominant frequency of only 10 Hertz. Okay, so that is what I wanted to show you about Fourier transforms. So are there any questions here?
This is something very interesting that you clean it and
Yeah.
I mean digitally you clean the signal.
Yeah.
That is something interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so you can start with a very noisy sample, and you can step by step clean up what you don't want. Okay. Yeah, there was
Can
another.
you please
Yeah.
can you please show the part of the code which subtracts the signal again? Just
Yeah. So the code was actually very simple. The code was essentially if the frequency is this known contaminant frequency that you know, then you don't add it. That's all we did. So let's go back to the earlier version where what we did was we looked at all frequencies and we added all the frequency contributions, right? So there is no condition here. You add everything up and you get back your noisy signal. Whereas here what I did is that I know that these frequencies are contaminating. So I did not add them. Everything else I added up.
and then another question was like, if we see the original signal, like the contaminated one, at end it looks like it is symmetric at all parts. Like the noise is added symmetrically at all parts. But if we add gradually the noise or like subtract it, it seems like at the end points it is so large, and in the middle the noise is added less. Why it is so?
Yeah, so it is not that, so this mainly is an effect of the fact that we have a finite sample size. So if you have a much larger sample size, then these endpoint effects will become smaller.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just an artifact of how big your sample is.
So basically, if my so basically, if my signal would be large, then this would not be effective. Like this would not be visible like this.
If your signal is for long time, then probably it will not be.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why. So you can think of it in this way. So if you have, so this is just 1 second sample, right? So for 1 second sample, you cannot have frequencies that are smaller than smaller than 1 Hertz. You cannot represent correctly in a 1 second sample. So when you reverse this, essentially, so there are you get errors from. So what is essentially a Fourier transform does is it will give you components for all different values of frequencies, right? So in principle, it should go from 0 to infinity. But if you have a small time sample, then you can only go from 0 to 1 by t, faithfully.
Can we say something like this also? That when the signal is abruptly stopping, any abrupt change is like very high frequency components. So that kind of noise is added.
Yeah, sure, of course. That is also another thing that you can think of.
And where exactly in our sample, we have decided that how many times I have sampled and things like that. Sampling rate and
yeah. So that is actually here, right? So when we decided this lens space, this tells you how many samplings you have, right? So
So
sampling.
If we make that sampling, say LCM of these frequencies, will it look better? Right?
I don't know. We can try.
So say for example 8,000 or 800 at least.
Let's try. Okay, so we have this. the peak certainly looks sharper. Okay. So there are some that are looking nicer, some peaks not so much. Maybe we can increase this as well. Let's try. Okay, I think the code is not hard coded for any numbers.
I think we increase the frequency, that's why.
We did not increase the frequency actually.
The limits, the XY limit, no.
Yeah, but the peaks are now much sharper, as you can see.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll figure out what the thing happened there. I don't know why it is doing this. It's printing something strange. Let's see, what is signal again? MP by T 0 to 10. Where are we putting this? T comma signal. No, I don't know what is doing that.
It is going for up to T equal to 10, right?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe there's some hard-coded thing that I put there probably.
Okay.
I think this was here.
Yes.
Then
both look same.
Both look same, but then it's not visible for us. Yeah, I think one has to do this slowly. Probably doing it online is not a good idea.
One and 8,000, maybe 1 and 8,000.
1 and 8,000 you want? Okay.
And somewhere you change that second signal.
It's taking a while. Yeah, it looks much better. See, the reconstructed and the original are now much similar, much more.
So
same.
we can say that it is always a trade-off between how much
Yeah.
computation power and how much better signal we want.
Yeah, we can also sort of overlap it and see what the difference is. So you can see it's almost exactly the same.
Yes.
Okay, good. So then we can do the subtraction also again. Very good. So now
that's so clean.
Yeah, it's very clean. Yeah. So okay. So then this was our lesson from this, that you need really a small step size for this to work. So you need to sample really, really closely.
And now it is, I think, this table shows that you are actually looking for up to 4,000 hertz frequency component.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So now it knows that everything at the top is 0. Top end is 0, so it reconstructs it very exactly. Okay, good. So this was a nice thing. I also learned something. Good. All right. So now we can go to what we have planned for today. So there are 2 things that I've planned for today. So the first one of that is a visualization of the wave packet. And the second is we are going to solve the Schrodinger equation for the simple case of harmonic oscillator. Okay. So let's start with thinking about the wave packet. So let's start with a very, very basic idea. So you remember that a plane wave is given by this particular form, right? So actually what we can do is we can turn it into Not time clock. So if you want to simulate a wave that looks like e to the I kx, we know that that is cos kx plus I sine kx, right? Remember, k is related to momentum. Okay, so the wave number essentially is a quantity that is related to the momentum with the factor of h cross. Okay, so let's say k is 10, then you can plot what the real and imaginary component will be. As expected, it looks like this, oscillatory. You can also plot the imaginary component. What happened? You can see that the real and imaginary components are out of phase. Okay, and you can plot the square of real plus imaginary, that's the absolute value, and this is always at 1 as expected, right? So this essentially tells us that that this seems like a sensible plane wave description. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to create a wave packet. So remember, a wave packet is essentially the way we describe particles in terms of wave behavior. Okay. So when we want to describe a particle in quantum mechanics, what we say is that it has a wave function if you look at the probability of where the particle can be, that function of probability is looks like a Gaussian. So there is a maximum probability of it being in some location, and then there is a delta x spread of where it can be, and the delta x is essentially given by the width of the Gaussian. Okay, so this is what we want to simulate. So first of all, I'm going to do a very simple job where we are going to use what we already know to try and just visualize, and then we are going to construct a realistic wave packet. Okay, so I'm just going to define this Gaussian function with user given mean and sigma, and so basically it just returns the normalized Gaussian function. Okay, so that's how you define it, e to the minus x minus mean whole squared divided by 2 sigma squared, and then there is a normalization of 1 by sigma square root 2 pi. Okay. All right. So let's plot what the Gaussian looks like, and as expected, so if you have a Gaussian of centered at 0 and with the width of 0.5, then this is what the Gaussian looks like. Okay, so this 0.5 is somewhere. Somewhere here. So this falls at 0.5. Okay. So another thing that, since we already know, we can sort of start by assuming, and then we will also we will see that this happens when we do realistic wave packets as well. So we know that there is this Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which tells us that the error in x and the error in momentum should be greater than half h cross. So we are working in units where h cross is equal to 1. So we want something like this. So which is why if you start assuming that you have a delta k of 1, then your delta x should be half. Okay. All right. So this is what your Gaussian looks like, and we can also integrate over the Gaussian. So there's so if your probability, if your wave function is Gaussian, then your probability is the square of the wave function, right? So you can also square it and integrate it. So there's a very simple way of integrating that I've done here, which is just taking the values at some intervals and then multiplying it by dx. So this is basically just sum of f of x dx. Okay, so that's how you integrate it, and you can see that it's very, very close to 1 as expected. Okay, so now we are ready to model our Gaussian wave packet. So we know what the real and imaginary parts of the wave function look like, and we know what the overall normalization looks like. Okay, so this is the overall normalization, which is Gaussian, and then you have the real and imaginary parts. So we can try and plot what this looks like, and the blue curve is the real part, and the red orange curve is the imaginary part. So you can see that if you interpret this as the probability, which we will do in a minute, then you would expect that the particle has a large probability to be at 0 and some non-zero probability to be in these regions away from 0. Okay, so let's compute the probability, which is given by psi squared, and this is just wave real squared plus wave imaginary squared. Yeah, so then you can just plot that, and you can see that it looks Gaussian as expected. Okay, and then we can also check the integral of this probability by again summing up and multiple. So this is basically you can think of this as having a histogram with some small dx width for each bar, and then you are just summing up the heights of the histograms and then multiplying it by dx every single time. So this is just another way of representing the integral. Okay, so you can check that, and the probability is 1 as expected. So the reason I wanted to show you is to convince you that this is a reasonable model of a wave packet. So it has this Gaussian probability as we expect, and the probability sums to 1. Okay, so now what I want to show you is this idea of phase and group velocities. Okay, so we come across these terms quite often, and yeah, you will hear statements like the phase velocity can be greater than the speed of light, but it doesn't mean anything because it does not carry any information, or it's only the group velocity that carries that tells you about how the particle moves and so on. So what do these words actually mean? So we can think of that, we can visualize them here. Okay, so so first. Let's look at this. Okay, so what I showed you before was essentially just how the x or rather the position component of the wave function looks like, right? So we had the wave function that depended on x, but it did not tell us how it moves with time. Okay, so if you remember your quantum mechanics, you can write your time-dependent wave function as your space-dependent wave functions times this exponent minus IET, where E is your energy, and this mainly works because you are working with energy eigenstates. Okay, so if you work with energy eigenstates, then your time translation is given by this exponent minus IET. Okay. And this E by h cross you can write in terms of frequency nu. So you can write this simplified form where you have psi x t is simply psi x0 times exponent of minus I mu t. Okay. So this was a complex number already, and now we know that this guy is also a complex number. And if you want to multiply two complex numbers, so a plus ib times c plus id, then we know that the real component looks like this, ac minus bd, because you have I times I, which gives you minus 1, and then I times bc plus ad. Okay, so that's the imaginary component. So this is essentially what we're going to implement. So we had the real and imaginary parts as before, and we had the Gaussian envelope as before, okay, which gave us the wave. And then what we want to do is we want to essentially do this AC minus BD kind of thing. Okay. So remember this guy, exponent I nu t is also cos nu t minus I sine nu t. So you can use that and you can calculate what is the time translation of the real and imaginary part with the time translation. Okay, so all right. Okay, so this. Okay, so let's start with t equals 0. Okay, at t equals 0, we have only one waveform. So I'm only going to plot the real components because we know that the imaginary components are just phase shifted with respect to the real components. Okay, so let's just plot the real component. So this is at t equals 0. There's only one curve, and we can compare it with some non-zero t. So if you say 0.1, so you notice that after 0.1 second, your the crest that you have here has moved a little bit, right? You can go to 0.2. It has moved a bit more. Okay, you can go to 0.3. It has moved a bit more further, right? So this is essentially that tells you that the wave that is inside the wave packet is moving through the wave packet at this particular frequency or at this with time. Okay, so this is how you can visualize the phase velocity. So this is the velocity inside the wave packet, and at all times your probability is still the same. So we are not moving the whole wave packet so far. Okay, we are just
why there is a phase change between the two components?
The real and the imaginary, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, it's because just one is sine and the other is cos, no? So there is a natural.
No, true, but with this, was that phase changing in the inside the packet?
So this is the phase change only in the real component. So we can also do the phase change in the imaginary component if we want.
Okay.
So we can plot that as well.
No, so when you are saying,
can I interrupt, Mahesh?
Yes.
No, it's e raised to I theta is cos theta plus I sin theta. So real part and imaginary part are always pi by 2 apart. Hello?
Yes. No, I wanted to know whether we can simulate when the wave is passing through the wave group, and so how do we simulate that?
What do you mean wave is passing through the wave group?
No, what I mean is you were showing that phase velocity is higher than the group velocity.
No, I'm just showing you. Yeah, I'm just showing you that the phase velocity, what phase velocity is. So phase velocity is inside the wave packet itself. How the internal waves move.
Yes.
Right. So each frequency.
Just show that again, because I think probably I skipped something important.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm doing here is essentially I am just plotting. So what I did was I just multiplied this the time independent component and the time dependence. Okay, and remember that inside our time independent component we have this wave or other wave which has this kx form, right? So essentially this so this is what gives you these oscillations.
That is space part.
That is the space part. And what the time part is doing is it is moving this space component of these inside waves as time passes. So let's so let's start with 0. Let's go to the real one.
Okay, sorry, I had missed the legend. I thought the two colors are two different
no,
real and imaginary part. Okay,
Actually,
I had, yes,
I should increase the size. Yeah. So this is at t equals 0, and then you can run it for say equals 0.2, and you see that it has moved a little bit. And you can do t equals 0.4, and you see that the second trough is now catching up, and t equals 0.5, 0.5, 0.6, and by 0.6 it has caught up. Right, so essentially this is the group velocity where these troughs move inside your wave packet.
got that, ma'am.
Yeah, okay, good. So we can again check what is happening to the probability, and this is just a sanity check, and it tells us that the probability is still Gaussian, even though this internal internal phase velocity is going on. Okay. So now we want to ask, how does the whole wave packet move? Okay, so this is essentially, you can think of the midpoint of the wave packet moving, and what is the velocity of that? Okay. So to answer, yeah. So before we answer that, I also wanted to talk about the spread of this wave packet. Okay, so this is another thing that we need to talk about. As the wave packet moves or as time passes, what happens? Okay, so let's start with constructing our wave packet. Okay, as before, so we have the cos component and the sine component and the Gaussian envelope, and we did this multiplication with the time dependent part. Okay, so what we want to do next is to take the fast Fourier transform of this wave. Okay, so the wave is now, so before when we were just doing the wave mechanics part, we were just talking about real functions, but now we have complex functions. So we have a wave that looks like wave real plus I times wave imaginary. So in Python you write the complex number as like this. Okay, and then you can take the fast Fourier transform like we did last time. Okay, so this is using just a slightly different notation, using the FFT frequency array that is provided by the FFT. So last time we constructed the frequency array, so FFT provides the frequency array with this strange normalization, which is why it is kind of hard to intuitively realize it, but you can also extract the frequency array from the FFT package. Okay, so this is the absolute value of the FFT, which is what we plotted before as well, and then this is the frequency array. Okay, so you can do that, and you see that you have an array, or rather the Fourier transform of this Gaussian looks also like a Gaussian, and it's centered at 20 because your k was 20. Okay, so you can actually change this and check, and it will move to 10. So that is your central frequency. Okay, let's go back to 20. And the other thing that you can do is you can change your Gaussian envelope. Okay, so remember, this Gaussian envelope is for your x. Okay, so right now the envelope width is 0.2. If I make it 0.1, you will see that the k envelope has become wider. Right, this is because this gives you a delta x, and this will give you a delta k, which is essentially proportional to delta p. So we know that delta x, delta p is supposed to be constant. So if your particle is very, very localized, then your momentum is not as clearly determined. So you can go the other way around as well. You can have a diffuse particle, and you can have which will give you a much sharper determination of the momentum. Okay, so this is sort of an illustration of the uncertainty principles. Let's go back to what we had. So we constructed a wave packet, but the wave packet was kind of strange, right? So in our wave packet, we imposed the Gaussian envelope by hand, And in principle, what was moving was just one frequency. So there was just this one kx, and similarly just this one nu t. So just corresponding to one particular energy. How do you construct a realistic wave packet? So this is what I want to address next. And we also already know the answer to that, and that is using these interference techniques that we've been talking about over the last 2-3 years. Okay, so this is just a quick illustration of beats that we've been doing for so long. So suppose you have these 3 k values. So there's k equals 10, k equals 12, and k equals 8. You can add them up, and you will get what looks like these beats. So essentially, you can think of adding more and more waves so that you have only the central one remaining and the side ones becoming smaller and smaller. So we can try to do that as well. So instead of just having +2 and -2, what I did was I summed over a larger range of frequencies. Okay, so I summed over 20, and you can see that if you sum over 20, you get something. Okay, so you can imagine that based on different k values, you might get if you add more and more k values, you get a more and more localized wave packet. So this is just to intuitively understand how to get more localization. But now we are going to yeah. So okay, another thing that I want to show you. Okay, so this is a wave packet. If you calculate the probability naively, then because you are adding multiple waves, each of which has a maximum of 1, right? So if you just do this, then your real squared plus imaginary squared, which is the absolute value of the wave function, is not going to sum up to 1. So in this case, it sums to some number 128. So if you want to make a realistic wave function, then what you need to do is you need to divide by this normalization. So if you define n as this integral of the probability, then you divide by 1 by square root of n, which means when you square the wave function, you will be dividing by n, and you get back 1. Okay, so you can do that as well. So this is what the probability distribution then looks like. Okay, the probability density then looks like, and you can count the integral, and the integral is 1. Okay, so now we come to having a realistic wave packet. So let me just do these initializations, because what I want to do is I want to show you essentially, first of all, how the whole wave packet moves when you have this full function, right? And secondly, what I want to also show you is how the spread of the Gaussian wave packet changes as it moves through time. Okay, so all right, so let's start. So I first made my X array, which goes from -20 to 20. That's the position range that I'm going to use. And then instead of using some fixed values of k, what I did was I actually took k from a random normal distribution, which had a mean of 10 and a variance of 0.5. And I took 1000 such points. So instead of doing this addition of plus and minus 2 by hand, we now have a realistic sampling of what kind of waves are in your wave packet. Okay, so then you have this y real and y imaginary equals 0. So I'll explain what this R count is in a minute. And what I want to do is I want to see what the wave packet looks like at time t equals 0. Okay, so I defined nu in the following way as n by 2 pi. Okay, and then I calculate the real and imaginary components by just summing this cos kx times cos nu t for the real part, plus sin kx sin nu t for the real part, and similarly the opposite combination for the imaginary part, same as we did before. So the only change here is that your k is taken from a random normal distribution properly, and that your nu and k are now properly related as well, right? So the frequency and the wave number are related at fixed energy. So because k is proportional to p and E is also proportional to h nu, so you have this relation. So they are no longer arbitrary. Okay. So then you can calculate the probability. You calculate the sum of the integral of the probability, and you normalize your wave function, and then you have your probability again, which is now normalized. Okay. So now I can explain what that error count thing was. So what I want to do is I want to essentially compare where the wave packet is at time t equals 0, time t equals 20, and time t equals 100. So I want to save that in different arrays. So I just define y real 1, y imaginary 1, similarly y real 2, y imaginary 2, and y real 3, y imaginary 3. And then by setting this switch along with this, the y real and y imaginary that we calculate are going to be stored in the respective arrays. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Okay, so let me run that. Okay. So at t equals 0, you have this wave packet that is centered at 0. Total probability is normalized to 1, and it has now been stored in this y real 1 and y imaginary 1. Okay. Now we can do 2. And this guy is 20. So you can see that the wave packet has moved a little bit after 20 seconds. Your probability is still normalized, and your array is now stored in the second one. And then we can do the third one. Okay. So now you can see it has moved quite a bit towards the end of our frame, and the third part is saved as well. So now what I want to show you is exactly what the wave packet looks like. And yeah, so first of all, I calculated this probability array, which was just y real plus y imaginary squared for the 3 cases. And then what I want to calculate here is, the first thing is mean, is integral of x times mean position, right? It is the integral of x times px. And then I want to calculate the spread of the position integral, right? So for that, we need to calculate the variance. Right, which is given like this, right? So this is x square bar minus x bar squared. So that's your variance. So basically that is what this array is doing. So for the 3 cases that we saved, 1, 2, and 3, we are going to calculate the mean and the variance, and we are going to append this to this array so that we can check. Okay. So let me first plot what the 3 wave packets look like. Since we've saved the y real and y imaginary, let me just plot the real components for the 3 cases. Okay, so T1 was 20 and T2 was 100. Right. So you can see that the whole wave packet moves with time. So this is essentially the group velocity. Okay, so this So first we initially we saw the phase velocity, which was how the trough moves in a single Gaussian wave packet. So that was more a visualization than anything else. But here we have taken a realistic sampling of k values, and which means, and we also have assigned the new values that based on the k value. So the energy is determined by the k value. Okay, so which is why you have this realistic motion now of the wave packet. Okay, so so the second thing that I wanted to show you was the spread of, well, it's not the k Gaussian, actually it's the x Gaussian. So you might have read that as even if you start with a very localized particle, as time goes on, the particle spreads, right? Yeah.
Is it possible to explain that physics part on Jamboard or something?
Which one?
The whatever physics part you're discussing, you know, how things would, what we expect as a Gaussian moves.
Okay, so yeah, let me try. Okay, so all right. So yeah, can you ask the question a bit more in detail? Then it will be easier for me to
Yeah,
explain.
you were demonstrating that there is a wave packet and
Yeah.
how it progresses with time,
Right.
and we are expecting what should happen if it becomes a Gaussian wave packet. Okay, so I mean, because there is a lot of code there, there, I mean, I find it distracting. Probably might be
Okay. So what? Okay, so let me write down what we've done. So before we had a, doesn't simply show me. We had a toy wave packet, right? So the toy wave packet was sine kx times Gaussian, right? So the trouble with this was that you have only one value of k, right? So the only thing that I could show you with this Gaussian wave packet was how this 1k changes with time. When you multiply this by e to the I minus IET, we could see how this 1k changes, right? So that is why you could see the phase velocity.
yes.
Phase velocity of this wave. Okay. When you have multiple k's, each k wave moves differently, right? So they don't all move together, and that is because your nu is given by this k by 2 pi. I think that's the expression. Let me check again. Yeah. So because of this, so this is essentially telling you that the energy corresponding to each k is a different energy, right? So each wave moves differently, which is why, so if the first wave, so let me draw it like this. So if you had a wave that was like this, and then another wave that was like this, after some time, the first wave would have moved maybe like this, and the second wave would have moved maybe like this. Okay, so each wave moves at a different speed. It's not showing up on the Jamboard. Okay, yeah, so that's how the second wave moves. Yeah, sorry, I think there is a lag between my writing and then it's showing up on the Jamboard. So what happens then eventually is that you have a wave packet that was like this and had many different waves inside. Eventually, after time, some of the waves have moved forward, some of the waves have not moved forward so much, and overall, you have a wave packet that appears to have moved. I mean, that has moved. Okay, so this here, point over here. And this happens specifically because each of the K waves move at a different speed.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, so that is why we needed to simulate a realistic Gaussian wave packet, and we could not do it with the toy example, which had just one sine wave inside.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
can we show group velocity and phase velocity together in a single plot?
I don't think it
differentiate.
would be very possible. What we can, let me see if we can try. Okay, so what we need to do for that is we need to isolate one particular K value and see how it moves with time, and also plot how the overall group envelope moves with time. Okay, so let me see if we can do that. Okay, so I have no idea what these K values look like. We need to pick one, so let's see. Let me put this in a different. Let me put these things in a different place so that I can at least play with it and pick a K value. Let's say print K vals 0. Okay, good. That's a good start. So let's assume that the very first K value, which is very close to the mean, is the one that we want to look at. Okay, so let me define also y real 0, 0, y imag 0 equals 0, and we can put another statement here saying y real if n equals 0, then y real equals okay. So this is just for a particular guy. All right, we also need multiple okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is what was it called? Array. Okay, so what I've done is basically for the zeroth component, I have isolated what the real and imaginary parts are so that we can look at them later on. Okay, so let us run this for the 3 cases. So let's start with 0, time is 0. Okay, so that was the first one. Then we have, oh, sorry. This is not going to work either. Oops. Count is 1, time is 0. Okay, that gives you your first one. Array count is 2, time is 20. That gives you your second one. And array count is 3, time is 100. That gives you your third one. Okay, so now let us see if we can do some plotting. So this is the first thing that we want to plot. Which is the overall Gaussian wave packet. And the second thing we want to plot is y real array. Hopefully this works. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, let me. So this is just a wave, right? So there's the overall interference that gives you the shape of the Gaussian wave packet. So if you just pick one wave, then it's just going to look like a wave. So just to make it look a bit more Gaussian, what I'm going to do is just define this probability like this. And I'm going to multiply it with the probability density function. So at least we know what it looks like. Okay, so this was the last one. Okay, so let me also define the probabilities 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 3. Okay, so XPR1 and then array 0. What happened now?
Multiply with PR1.
Ah, yes, absolutely right. Good. So that was the first case. So here, the trough of the wave function is matching the trough of the. So let's do PR2. And here you see that the troughs are no longer matching, so that the inside wave is moving at a different velocity, or rather a different different velocity than the envelope, right? And we can also do 3. And here again, it's close to matching. Okay, so maybe, yeah, it might be possible to make this more visually attractive by choosing a smaller frequency.
Okay, the task for Jigger to make a video of this.
Yeah.
We will do.
Yeah. So if you loop over multiple what you can say, timestamps, then you can see that the inside wave moves with a different velocity than the outside one. Okay, good. So the final thing that I want to show you is that we want to see that the packet gets wider as time passes. And for that, what I've done, so instead of looking at only 3, I've just decided to plot it for 5 different time values. Okay, so I just make the same exercise where you sum the real and imaginary parts, calculate the probability, and I've defined these arrays x up 2 and x square abs 2 and similarly dx2. So the dx2 contains values of dx, which is the square root of x square bar, x square bar minus x bar squared. Okay, and what I'm doing is I'm basically just plotting these values for different values of time as time passes. So time starts with 0 and goes to 500. Okay, in this case, so no, goes to 5. Okay, good. So, all right. Right. So basically so I'm just plotting dx, right? How dx changes with time. So you see that you started with a smaller dx and as time went by, your dx changed and it always increases. So this is a demonstration that as time passes, your wave packet becomes larger and larger. So, all right. So this is mainly what I wanted to show you about wave packets. Yeah, is there a question?
Can the wave packet itself be shown becoming wider?
It's not, you can, but so you should already be able to see this here. But the fact is that you cannot detect it by eye. It's not, the difference is not that big. And the second thing is, I mean, yeah, so what you want to really look at is the expectation value, the expectation value of x and the variance of x that matters, right? So yeah, it's not always easy to see using these kinds of forms. Where was this? Yeah, so even in this, we should have been able to see that it becomes wider. But yeah, for just the eye, I think it was very hard to see.
Is it possible if we subtract the x shift reference and keep the packet at the center and see how it becomes, whether it becomes wider?
Yeah, I have to figure out how to do that. Yeah, maybe I'll do this after we finish and then I can send the notebook,
Yeah.
right? I think it's, we should at least do one Schrodinger equation before we finish. So then
Yes,
if
yes,
we want, we
that's
can
more
do it tomorrow.
important.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. So this was about visualization of wave packets and group and phase velocity. So I hope you at least have some intuitive understanding of what is going on now. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we are going to try and solve a harmonic oscillator. Okay, so a harmonic oscillator, remember, has a potential that looks like half kx squared. So let me write that using Markdown. So you have v of x is equal to so this is what your potential looks like. And I will explain the Schrodinger step in a minute. Okay, so our goal is to solve the Schrodinger equation with this particular potential. So maybe, I don't know if everybody remembers the Schrodinger equation, but maybe I can just write it down so that everybody remembers. Okay, so remember your Schrodinger equation looks something like this. So I'm just talking about one dimension here. So it's minus h cross squared by 2m del square psi by del x squared minus d of x psi is equal to p psi. So this is the time independent Schrodinger equation. Right? So this is what we want to solve, and we want to solve it in a potential where Vx is equal to half kx squared. Okay. All right. So the potential looks essentially like this. Right. So if this is x, this is v of x. So sorry, my drawing was not great, but this is 0. So the potential is 0 at 0, and it increases parabolically on both sides. So when x is either positive or negative. Okay, and you will remember that this is also the same potential that we use for classical harmonic oscillators, and it can describe, for example, a particle that the x motion of a particle that is actually in a physical well that is shaped like this, and so you have this x motion in these directions. Or for example, the pendulum or the spring. So all of these are described by this kind of potential. So this is what we want to solve. All right. Yeah, okay, let me maybe simplify this a bit before we go ahead. All right, so remember what we used to do when we want, so this is a second order differential equation, right? So remember what we have wanted to do when we wanted to solve the second order differential equation. Right, so what we did was we defined, so let's say psi is our function that we want to solve. Then you have d psi by dx, and you have d2 psi by dx squared. So these are the two different equations that we want to write. And this guy we call, say, psi v. Then this guy becomes d psi v by dx. Okay, so you can make an array of psi and psi v, and then you can have basically a matrix psi v at t equals 0. So there is some matrix here, and you know how to go from t equals 0 to t equals 1. So that's what we did, right, the last time when we were solving these differential equations. So this time we are going to do something very similar. Okay. Okay, good. So yeah, so this is what the Schrodinger step does. It is it tells you how your psi 1 looks in terms of psi 0. Okay, and similarly how psi v1 looks in terms of psi v. So you can sorry, I did not change the tab anyway. Okay. So this equation, you can essentially work with units where h cross and m are 1. Okay, you can take v to the other side, and then you just have this d square psi by dx square equation. Okay, which we are going to encode in this Schrodinger step. So you want to write psi 1 in terms of psi 0 like before. So again, we are using the Euler method here, and then psi v1 in terms of psi v. Okay, so in fact we can remove this as well, and the potential function is defined like this, right? So half kx squared. So you can change k if you want. Okay. So then what I do is I set some initial conditions for psi 0 and psi v, psi and psi v. I set some ranges for my x. And since for the harmonic oscillator, we know that the wave functions correspond to h cross mu by 2 for the ground state, and then each extra one is where you add 1, right? So 1 h cross every single time. So the first state is half h cross, the next state is 1.5 h cross, the one state after that is 2.5 h cross. Okay, since h cross is 1, we don't need to worry about that. I also set k equals 1, and we can do your solution essentially by what we did before in the Euler method. Okay, so we started by defining the Schrodinger step, and we basically got psi and psi v based on the Schrodinger step, and then we appended the psi and psi v, and then the old becomes new, and then you repeat, right? So that's how you solve it. Finally, so after you've solved this, you get some function, numerical value of the function for psi, which you are going to normalize. So I'll explain the edges in a minute. So this is basically just normalizing as before. So you calculate the n as the sum of the probability, and then you divide it by 1 by square root of n. And then now that we have this function for getting the solution for a particular value of e and k and so on, I've just solved the function for 3 different values of e. Okay, so these 3 values that we had, 0.5, 1.5, and 2.5. And we've just plotted these 3 values. Okay, and then this is just the x-axis for comparison. Okay, so this is what the plot looks like. So the first, I should have actually given it labels. Let me give you the label. It. Okay, so that's and right, so these are the 3 values. So for the ground state, you see that the wave function peaks at 0. Get slightly smaller, yeah. And then for the others, you can see that for the first state above the ground state, you have this kind of antisymmetric wave function, which is the orange one. And then for the third one, you have this kind of wave function. Okay. So there was so I've cheated a little bit in showing you these solutions, and that cheating essentially lies in the fact of how this normalization was done and how this plotting is done. So you notice that I have set the x-axis to be a slightly smaller one than before. And if I plot the full x-axis from -5 to 5, you see that what happens at the end is that you have these weird divergences of the solution. Okay, so I wanted to show you this because what this is telling you is that there is a numerical instability in your calculation. So the Euler's method that you're using is not actually stable enough to give you a sensible solution. So you need to actually go to a more sophisticated method. And I tried doing this with smaller dx sizes and so on, and it doesn't really seem to help very much. So you really need to go to a more sophisticated system which has better behavior for these kinds of calculations. But if you restrict to smaller, well, I mean, for heuristic purposes or for educational purposes, you can see that these are the functions. So what we're going to do is we are going to use an inbuilt method that is provided by the scientific computing library in Python called SciPy. So in this particular notebook, I actually imported this ODE int, which is ordinary differential equation integrator, which is provided by this library scipy.integrate. Okay, so this is what we are going to use to solve the same equation or the same Schrodinger equation. Okay. All right. So this is a much okay. So let me first show you the manual for this scipy.integrate. So every time if you want to look up a new function, you can always type in Google, say Python ordinary differential integration, and it will show you the options, and most likely you will come to this scipy.integrate, and there are these very detailed online manuals always available. So you can always use this reference guide to understand what this code does. Okay, so so what this so what this function does is it's easiest to understand if you look at the example that they have. Okay, so the example that they have is of this differential equation here, which is theta second derivative, theta prime prime plus b times theta prime plus c times sine theta is equal to 0. So this is a second order ordinary differential equation. And as before, you define an omega. So since what we call psi v, so in this case, so they have theta, so they define a variable called omega, which is theta prime. Okay, and then they split up their differential equation in the two into so one second order differential equation into two first order differential equations, the same as we do. Okay, and then how you use this ODE int function is that first you need to define a function that returns dy by dx. So in this case, your y is an array of all the variables. So in this case, that is theta, which is the first one, and omega, which is the second one. Okay, so you need a function that returns dy by dt. Okay, so the first component of the list that it will return is going to be d theta by dt, which by definition is omega. And the second function that it's going to return is d omega by dt, which we know by splitting this ordinary differential equation into two is minus d omega minus c sine theta t. Okay, and then you return dy by dt. If you want to give some arguments for this for the parameters that the function uses, then you can do that as well. Okay, so then we go to how to call your scipy integrate. So this ODE int, and the way you do this is you say ODE int, give the name of the function that gives you this array of dy by dt, and then you give an array of initial conditions. Okay, so in this case, there are two initial conditions. The first one is for theta 0, the second one is for omega 0. In our case, it will be for psi 0 and psi v 0. Okay, then you have the array over which you are integrating. In this case, it's time. In our case, it will be x. And then you can give any arguments that need to be passed to the dy by dt function. Okay, so I hope everybody has understood how to call this ODE int function. Okay, good. So that's what we are going to use. So so the dy by dt function in this case, so is called psi, or let me rename it so that is easier to understand. Okay, so this is the dy by dt function. Right. So the first, yeah.
Not change the screen.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So can you see now? So there is this dy by dt function. The first of this is a list of all y's, and the second is the array over which you are integrating. Okay. So since this guy is a list, you can call your psi and your so maybe let me call it what we had before. Okay, so we had psi and psi v, and then you say okay, let me not change it right now. It makes it too complicated, I think.
Even that psi and psi v are for the y, why
Sorry?
it is equated for y, equated to y.
Sorry?
That psi and psi v are like parameters to be like given to y.
No, no. It's so these are so y. Let me write it here. Y is a list that contains psi and psi v at the particular value of x, or rather, yeah. So that those are going to be the array. So you can think of this as of x, psi v of x, and then this x is x array. You can think of it. So let me define it that way. So let me call this x. Yeah. So this x is going to be essentially the coordinate. Okay. This is the function given. So y in this case is not a function. It is just this array that contains these two quantities. So let me go back to the Jamboard. So remember, we wrote the equation in this form, right? So you had psi and psi v. So this is what I'm calling y.
Okay, so you're just naming it.
Yeah, it's just a name.
Okay.
Right. So basically, it's a name because it's dy dx. Okay. So it's a name because you're basically calculating dy by dx. Okay. Then instead of psi, we are going to call dy by dx. Okay. And we're going to call the ODE int in the form that I showed you. So this is the function. These are the initial values. So the initial values that we are taking are 0 and 0.01. And the val is the array over which you want to scan your x's. So you want to scan your x from -5 to 5. And you want to split it into, say, 101. Okay. So then, so the way it returns, so way ODE int returns your functions are essentially a 2 cross n array. Okay. And the first column of which is what contains your solution. So this is how you extract that solution. Okay. And then then I did the normalization, which is just sum over the probability, and then you have divided by 1 by square root of n. Okay, so just as before. And you can see that this gives you, so this was for the first case. I think the energy is already high. Yeah. So for e equals 0, this was your first wave function. And then I also plotted the probability distribution, probability density function. Okay, so since the wave function is less than 1, the probability distribution function looks smaller in amplitude, but it sums up correctly to 1, as is ensured by this normalization. Okay. All right. So you can.
Well, what will happen if we remove that normalization factor? Can you?
Yeah, sure. Let's remove the normalization factor. So you get something. You can't even see the wave function. It's very small. So it's a very large number.
Okay,
Ma'am,
Yeah.
can you once show where you have defined y? What is actually?
Here. So y is essentially psi x and psi v. So for each step, you take the psi x, psi v, and then you return. Let me actually define it properly. Okay. dy dt equals. So I just made one more step. So let's go back to the Jamboard. Okay, so the thing that you need to return is d psi dt, right? Because y is psi and psi v. So d psi by dt is psi v. So you're returning psi v. Okay. And the second term down here is d psi v by dx, right? So d psi v by dx, we know what it looks like by using this equation, right? So maybe I can also write the simplification. Oops. Where are we?
Yeah, plus V.
Okay. Yeah. So then you have d psi v by dx. So you would have essentially minus 2m by h cross plus cross squared v of x minus v of x, or e times psi. Right? This is what your d psi v by dx would look like. So since everything is 1, so we ignore these things and we just have what is left over. So you can actually remove this mu, it's not important. And you're just returning essentially what you had there. So I can also maybe simplify this. 2 star. So this was your dx minus right? There is a mismatch somewhere. I think we need another one. We don't need this. Okay, good. Now, so that's what you've returned. So we've returned d psi by dx and d psi v by dx. Is that clear now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
Ma'am,
yeah.
I
So,
have a doubt.
yeah.
If y is a list, why are we not including in a square bracket?
What do you mean? Y is a list. Why are we not including it in the square bracket? Meaning? Y is, so you can always pass a list just as Y, right? You don't need to enclose the name of the list in a square bracket. When you assign Y, so like in this case, dy by dt is a list and I'm assigning it. So I'm enclosing it in a square bracket and each of the components or rather each of the items are separated by a comma. But when I'm saying
Yes,
return dy by dt, I don't need to use square brackets anywhere.
No, I'm saying that psi, my comma psi iv, psi
No.
v should be in.
No, because I'm not
Square
making a
bracket.
list. What I'm doing is I'm saying that these two variables. So this is another way you can assign. So the way of writing that in another way would have been to write psi equals y0, psi v equals y1. So this is just a shortcut of extracting what y0 and y1 are.
Okay.
Okay, so since we are past, yeah, so we can maybe plot one more wave function. Yeah, so you see that there is no this weird behavior of things going haywire at large x here. So this seems to be a stable solution. Yeah.
Now this is something very interesting.
Yeah.
Will you just also make energy even higher, showing that now the central part is not becoming, E is remaining low and the peaks at the edges are becoming higher?
Let's try. I did not try this before, so let's see. I think we need to go to higher X range. Just a second. Let's go from -10 to 10. Did not work. Yes, there is some effect that you can see, but it's not as pronounced. Yeah, actually, you need to go wider if you want to go higher in the.
Well, maybe, yeah, because potential is also.
Yeah, potential is becoming wider, right, with X. So
-15 plus 15.
yeah, but it's giving an error, so I don't know what the error is. There's some runtime overflow, so it's not accurate enough. There's some overflow happening. It's not stable actually. Yeah, one has to see where the limits
yeah,
are.
fine.
Yeah. So the lower ones seem to be working fine. If you want to go to higher energy solutions, maybe you need a
No, suppose
even more
we
accurate.
go, I mean, probably we can explore by increasing in one step at a time. Maybe
Yeah.
that may help. But at
Yeah.
least in third or here we can make out that it is increasing. The peak is
Yeah, the peaks are
higher.
increasing. Yeah, so the probability peaks you can see are bigger at the edges. Yeah, I don't know how much higher we can go. They are increasing, but you can see that already here we are not at 0. You see, there is
Yes,
already
yes,
some instability
right,
happening.
right.
So we probably need to have a more specific differential equation solver than this standard ODE, and we might have to write it ourselves with
And
better.
probably also that extra boundary condition at this particular age. No, that will not
No,
count.
so what? Yeah, so what happens is, so we knew the answer. So this is actually another interesting thing that you can think of. So you know, for 0.5, it's a solution. What happens if you take 0.6? So this is actually always a problem when you want to work with Dirichlet boundary conditions, right? So Dirichlet conditions are essentially where you give the endpoints of psi. Whereas to solve the differential equation, what we are doing is we are giving psi and psi prime, right? Psi and d psi by dx. But when we actually solve it analytically, what we solve is by psi 0 and psi a or something like this. So
Yes,
the way
yes.
you solve this is you essentially try out various energies. So let's try out this other energy. And you see that it does not give you a stable solution. So it only gives you a stable solution when you have, when you hit the right boundary conditions. So in fact, we can go very close to this maybe. It's still too small. I think what we need to do is.
So here we can show that only certain energies are stationary or
Yeah,
certain
yeah,
energies.
yeah. But I'll show you what is happening. Plot dot what we want. X lim. Oh no, Y lim. So you see that there is a bump as expected, right? So the point is that we are normalizing. So everything looks weird because it is normalizing against this giant number. But you see that there is a bump here. So it tried to find a solution, but it did not hit 0 at the other end. And then it just went haywire. So it is only when it is the exact solution that you get the stable answer. So yeah, so you need to go through a lot of energies and to figure out which one is a stable one.
So that also gives us idea about only certain energies are giving you stable
Yeah, exactly.
quantization concept.
Yeah, exactly. So it's only these quantized energies that give you stable solutions.
Interesting.
Okay, I think we are well about time, so maybe it's time to stop here.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. So see you all tomorrow.
See you now.